Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Happy first day of market. Everybody had a great day? So how are the feet? You've just sat down. Oh, I see some thumbs up. We did okay. You got sneakers on, right? Yeah. That's how we know who the seasoned designers and buyers are. We look good from our ankles up. So I'm so glad to see you all here today, you're going to have a fantastic market this time, lots of new product, a lot going on in downtown High Point. But better than that, for the next hour, I'm so excited for you all to meet our keynote speaker. First, I want to just give a little plug to the other things going on around our market. The first I would invite you is tonight and tomorrow night, there will be fun entertainment in Center Stage, which is across the street in the Showplace parking lot. 6:30 tonight, we'll open the doors and a band called The City takes the stage. High energy, fun party band, free food and beverages. We hope you'll come out and join us. Tomorrow night, Bare Naked Ladies will be there. So absolutely, we hope that you mark your calendars. Also, tomorrow in this space at 3 p.m. will be Bobby Burke from Queer Eye. So we hope that you all will come out and join us for Bobby as well. But today, Jessica Bantam is the author of Design for Identity, How to Design Authentically for a Diverse World. Drawing from her background of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and design, she evaluates design as a profession and a process through the lens of cultural competence. We're proud to present this keynote today in partnership with our Diversity Advocacy Alliance, which is a group that has been coordinated by the High Point Market Authority and working on diversity within our industry. So we're excited to partner with them today to bring you Jessica. You're all in for a big treat because following the keynote today, Jessica will be signing her book in the Hooker showroom on the 3rd floor of Showplace. So make sure you make your way over to meet Jessica and to get that book. Without further ado, I want you all to give a big High Point welcome to Jessica Bantam.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good to see you all here. Thanks for joining. So as someone who specializes in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and design, instances of what I call, let's say, design gone wrong stand out to me. When I say design gone wrong, I'm speaking about designs that express that there was a culturally insensitive decision made in the process. There are just a few that I'm going to share with you before we dive in. The first is the series called Equality Stamps that the Spanish Postal Service issued in May of 2021, honoring the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, who actually would have turned 50 today. And in doing this, they created this series of stamps, and the basis of the design was they used different skin tones as an inspiration for the palette, which could already be kind of tricky territory. But where they really went wrong was that when they went to assign values to the stamps, they assigned the highest monetary value to the stamp corresponding to the lightest skin tone. And then the values went down as the tones got darker. Every time I tell that story, people's jaws drop and I hear the ohs, which is just an indication of, how glaringly obvious this seems to be, right? So these stamps went on sale on May 25th. Sales ended May 28th because the backlash was that quick and that severe. Then we have another instance. This time this was Louis Vuitton. Also in 2021, they launched a sweater honoring Jamaican heritage. And the description said that the colors were inspired by the colors of the Jamaican flag. Except the colors of the Jamaican flag are yellow, green, and black. This is clearly green, yellow, and red. And what they did was they chose this palette because this is actually representative of Rastafarianism, which is a part of Jamaican culture, but is not synonymous with Jamaican culture. Once again, backlash ensued. The internet is on it right away. And the comments there were just saying, how can there not be enough people of diverse backgrounds involved in the design process to catch things like this before they make it out into the world? So this was another item, went on sale one day and was probably within just a few days, it was taken down. And now moving to interiors, of course, I have to speak to some examples in interiors. These are just a couple of examples that correspond to a couple stories. The one on the left is, this chain link accessory, which I feel like we see everywhere, right? It's just become a trendy item that we see. But the context for this is everything. Someone brought to my attention a residential design that had been done for a Black homeowner. And the rest of the decor was celebrating her African ancestry. There was African art, there were masks and statues. It was a very celebratory kind of feel that was created in this design. And in the middle of all of that was this item sitting on the coffee table. And I was immediately struck by it, especially as a Black woman, because I look at that and it makes me think of bondage and slavery, which is obviously not in line with the overall theme of the space, which was meant to be celebratory of African heritage. And it was interesting because that person brought it to my attention. She wasn't even a designer, and she was like, this seems odd. And before she even said anything, I looked right at it. I was like, that's it. So that just goes to show the importance of keeping in mind the context of things, even if they seem to be something we're seeing everywhere. And then the other example here is a chandelier. I was watching a television show, and there was a designer, the hosts were a white couple. They were walking a Black couple in the South through their home, their newly renovated space. And when they got to the dining area, there was a light fixture somewhat resembling this there. And all I thought was rope hanging from the ceiling, ropes, lynchings, nooses. And it just stood out to me in a way where I was like, was that a conversation? Or was that something that was just, a design choice that was made without thinking, once again, about context and who the design was actually for? Now, there's no way I can say that those homeowners were necessarily offended, but I also think that they may have had a conversation about other choices that could have been made there. Now, as I mentioned, when I see examples like this, I have to ask myself, how did this make it out into the world? How do these design decisions that obviously send many different messages, especially according to who the audience is or who the homeowner is, who the person that we're designing for is, how do we make these choices that can be so offensive and harmful? And I'd like to think, though, that in the design process, one that also is very iterative and where we have a lot of discussion, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of approvals, what is going on in the design process that these things actually make it into the world? And I also thought about the display. I also thought about the groups of designers who are involved in each of these instances. And I'd like to think they probably fall into these three groups. One is a group of people who just didn't know. They weren't aware of the signal that their design choices were sending. So they may not have even known that there were different messages that could have been sent, and that there are also different options that could have been made to avoid doing that harm through design. The second group is some people who probably knew but didn't speak up. And I think this is probably a pretty good segment of what the design audience is kind of made up of. Some people would know maybe because they are part of a group that has historically been excluded. So they have that sensitivity to these types of messages that could also be harmful. But they also may have been in an environment where they didn't feel safe to speak up. They may have even thought other colleagues thought the same thing or had the same concern, but they didn't want to risk retribution, retaliation, being called sensitive, and being made to feel like they were just, doing too much by raising their hands or by bringing this up. So that would possibly discourage them from even bringing this to anyone's attention. There also may have been other people, maybe they weren't even, people who were from a group that was historically excluded, but they also didn't feel comfortable and they didn't feel safe to raise the issue. And then the last group is some people that just didn't care. I'd like to think this is the smallest group, but I'm sure that there are some people who maybe thought, we could have gone a different way with this. There were other options that we could have taken, that we could have chosen. But maybe they were like, nah, it's not that big of a deal, or this won't affect that many people, so let's just move on with the process. But like I said, I'd like to think most people fall into these first two groups, and those are the groups that I want to speak to. Those are the people that I want to empower as designers. And I think that the game changer for those people, and the game changer actually for design as a practice, is cultural competence. Cultural competence is the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from your own. And that also means understanding, appreciating, and interacting with people from different lifestyles, different backgrounds from yours, and people with different lived experiences. And this is really critical because cultural competence is about action. I intentionally highlighted the words understand, appreciate, and interact with. I think a lot of us have gotten into this space where our cultural awareness is expanding, especially since the murder of George Floyd, where we are having more conversations, and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is kind of a buzzword. Cultural awareness is good. We're starting to think about what these other backgrounds and experiences look like. But we need to move past that. What do we do with the information? Are we showing up differently based on having that information? And if so, how is that playing out? So that's what we need to get to. Now, I'm going to talk about the importance of cultural competence through a few different lenses. The first being through the lens of a business, as a design firm, a design organization. So why is cultural competence good for business? For one thing, it demonstrates commitment. As I mentioned, especially in the summer of 2020, there was a huge global reckoning happening around the importance of racial justice and social justice. Many organizations and individuals kind of reactively jumped out there and made statements. They were statements in support of social justice, in support of racial justice, and also intentions to stand with basically everybody, people of many different backgrounds. But the problem is, not much has changed since then. We're talking about it, but what's really different? Are you having different conversations with your design teams beyond, hey, we need to start recruiting? Or look, we got a black or a brown person on our board. The conversation needs to go further, and that's what cultural competence is about. It's like, how do we show up differently? How do we change the way we operate to bring about more positive outcomes for people who have historically been excluded? And that's important too, because we need to be intentional, because people are looking. People are looking for the answers. People are looking for the receipts. I will say, as someone who has interviewed younger professionals coming into the workplace, they're not just asking, do you stand for DEI? They want to know what you're doing about it. And most organizations don't have an answer. So that's what we need to focus on as an industry and as a profession. And that goes to building the narrative. In order to respond to those inquiries and those demands, we have to have stories to point to. We have to have success stories. And I would venture to guess not many people could even tell me what a success story might look like. And I don't say that to diminish anybody. I say it because we're not talking about it. And that's what we need to start focusing on. How do we build that narrative? How do we convince our future talent pool, our future customer base, that we hear them and we see them and we are doing something different? And then that we also need to factor in the importance of creating safety through dialogue. As I mentioned, in those instances of design gone wrong, there were likely many people in the room who saw it, just like I said on that first slide. When I pointed out the difference in the monetary values, I heard the and I see why, eyes get wide and I see jaws drop. There needs to be an environment created where when we see those things, we say something and that we stop it. As designers, if nothing else, we are creative problem solvers. There were probably a million other solutions they could have come up with for all of those instances that I shared with you. So we need to normalize that conversation about identity so that we can create an environment where we can talk about these things, where we can say, that's not quite hitting the nail on the head. That is not quite sending the message that we want to send. That does not align with our mission or our other values that we hold as an organization. And there are several benefits of cultural competence for business. I won't walk through all of them here, but I do go into detail about each of them in Design for Identity. And there are a couple I would like to highlight. The first benefit is relevance. Once again, as I mentioned, at this time where diversity, equity, inclusion, difference, and identity are becoming more a part of our conversation and our dialogue, we have to, as organizations, respond to that. And we have to show that we are, once again, doing more than talking. We are showing up in different ways. We are having different conversations. And we as designers are meeting the needs of this incredibly diverse world that we serve. If you look at that disconnect between the composition of the design profession and the diversity of the world that we serve, that's a concern. That's something that we need to address, not to make ourselves feel good, because this is not about feeling us, it's not about us. It is about creating more positive outcomes for people who have historically been excluded. And if your organization doesn't lean into this, but your competitor does, where is that going to leave you? Especially considering that our population is going to be, the US population solely, is going to be majority minority by the 2040s. Is your organization in a place to engage with that audience in a way that's going to be meaningful? And this isn't about a moment. This isn't about just jumping on the bandwagon. Once again, it's not about being responsive to what happened in 2020. This is about adopting habits that we are going to have to continue to evolve, because society is going to continue to evolve. And if, as an organization, you want to keep up with that, you have to start having these conversations. And another benefit I'll just speak to really quickly is, let's go with retention. Retention is key. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations, when they think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they think we need to recruit, which, yes, you likely do need to recruit in order to have more diverse voices among your workforce. However, you also need to pay attention to the diversity that exists within your organization. And keeping in mind, the second you have more than one person, you have diversity. However, there are also instances where we have diversity among us that we are not acknowledging. And when that happens, especially for people who outwardly are different, people like me, people who don't look like everyone else in the room, you see that. And you should recognize that those people are going to need to be actively included. This isn't just about saying, oh, look at us, we have a great, look at us when we take a picture, we put this up on the website. It shows we're diverse. You don't get a gold star for that. It is part of the process, it is significant, but what's more significant is if you create an environment where those people want to stay because they feel that their perspectives are valued and heard. So we've talked about what cultural competence looks like for a business. Let's start thinking about what it looks like in action. What does it look like in action for us as designers? What do the conversations sound like? I've really wanted to start digging into this because I feel that as a DEI professional, I've worked with many organizations that they were curious. They started having broader conversations about topics related to difference. Maybe they started learning about racial equity or gender equity, or they started learning about unconscious bias or microaggressions. That's great. That is all well and good, and you need that context in order to show up differently and to become more culturally competent. However, I feel like that's where a lot of people stall. It's like, okay, we did the training, now what? We have this new knowledge. What do we do with it? How do we connect it into what we do as designers? How do we apply that to how we engage with the people we work with day in and day out, whose identities, in many cases, are just not even acknowledged? The difference is there, but we don't feel like we can address it. So that led me to kind of boil down some of these concepts into what I call the 6 habits of culturally competent designers. These are some quick tips for things that we can do and ways that we can show up to show that we respect difference. The first of these is to take accountability. Don't wait for someone else to catch the issue or assume that someone else will speak up. Now, this goes back to, I mentioned in the first stories that I shared, there are likely people who noticed something was wrong, or people who said there was another way that we could have addressed this design challenge. But we can't wait for somebody else to catch those things. We as individuals, we have to stand up, we have to take this ownership ourselves to say, hey, something about that just doesn't look right. It doesn't sound right. It may not send the right message. So we can't sit around and, be the one in the room just looking, waiting for somebody else to be like, hey, what about this? What about that? We have to be willing as individuals to say, why don't we explore another option? Is there another way that we can address this particular design challenge? And as I mentioned, especially for people who are from backgrounds that have been marginalized, people who have historically been excluded, this is a challenging ask because most of us exist in spaces where identity is not addressed, where our own identity is not addressed, and we don't feel empowered to speak up. But this goes to the point of how collectively as design organizations, as design teams, we have to lean into this. Habit number 2 is to ask questions. And this is about asking questions among our colleagues. This isn't just asking questions of customers or anyone outside of the organization. It's about taking moments to ask questions like, have we considered all perspectives? And asking the people in the room, because sometimes it could be that someone else may not have an answer. And those moments may be where you realize, hey, we're kind of like operating in an echo chamber. We're the same team, we've worked on many projects before, we've had the same conversations many times before. How do we bring in different perspectives? How do we approach our work differently? And one way to do that, and one way to help create that environment where people feel safe to share their perspectives from their lived experience, is to ask questions like, have we considered all perspectives? It opens the door. It says, I actually care. I care enough to be asking. And I want feedback. And I want to learn how we could approach this design challenge differently. Habit number 3 is to seek knowledge. This is very critical. This is about being proactive about finding out about different lived experiences and different backgrounds that people are from. Do your research to find out about different cultures and identities and look beyond what's fed to you. Now, this is especially critical because in this day and age, we have more access to information than we ever have in history. So there's no excuse. There's no reason that we can say, well, I don't know about that lifestyle. I've never met somebody from that background, so it's okay if I don't know. Information is everywhere. Documentaries are out there, books are out there, TED Talks. I mean, there's so many things out there that there's no excuse not to actually access them and use them. And seeking knowledge is also something that we need to own individually, because sometimes I think that we're counting on other people to do the thinking for us or to do the sharing for us. For example, if you are from any dominant group, you may think, oh, I can't have that conversation until I bring those people into my organization. Or I can't have that conversation until the people that I'm with, I'm putting it on their shoulders to share their lived experience. Why don't they just speak up? There are many reasons why they don't speak up. But it's also that assumption that says a lot. If you are an organization that brings in people of a certain background, please know it is not on that person's shoulders. It is not their duty to spill their guts and share their lived experience with you. Don't assume that. That's not what they came to work for. Now, if you create an environment where difference in culture and identity becomes a normal part of the conversation, yes, I bet they'll become more forthcoming. But don't make the assumption and don't put it on their shoulders. So I mentioned if you're a person of a dominant group, if you are a predominantly white firm, don't wait until you hire black and brown people to start having this conversation. Once again, because it's not their responsibility to teach you. There's a plethora of information you can already access, and it is not their duty to do that. Once again, if you create the environment, you build the trust, you build the safety, where they feel comfortable sharing their perspectives and they know they'll be valued and heard, it's a whole different story. If you are able-bodied, it is not on people with different abilities to share their whole experience with you either. So we have to own this. We have to think about it. We have to be conscious of it and not set those expectations. And by the way, one really good way to find out about people of different backgrounds is to listen to their comedy. Comedy is it's probably the most candid insight you'll get into whatever Group A thinks about Group B. So just something to keep in mind. Habit number 4 is to talk to customers. Now this is really critical, and it's something that I think we do as designers, but it's something that we can work on. We can change the conversation. Don't presume to know what is culturally meaningful to customers. Engage with them. It's possible for us sometimes to, especially as residential designers, we may go into our customers' homes for the first time. We're looking around and we think we know their story. We may see photographs, we may see art. We may look at them and just think, okay, I got this. I can figure this out. I know how to tailor my design to this audience and to this customer. And that is definitely not the safest way to go. The idea is that, yes, we can be aware it's important to be open to having those conversations, but it's more important to actually have the dialogue with your customers. You may notice fact A, B, and C about them that you think you got right, but when you speak to them, the things that you're noting may not be the things that are most meaningful to them as individuals and think the things that they want to see celebrated in their space. So it's important to talk to them and have that conversation, and to also be open to the fact that some people's realities and the way they live their lives and their existence is completely different than yours. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to move in with them. You don't have to say, I'm going to do everything you do and live my life the way you live your life. As designers, though, we have to be willing to listen and take that information and incorporate it into what we are designing for them, because we're designing for them and not for us. And this isn't necessarily all about our comfort level. And habit number 5 is really critical. This is one that when I wrote it down, I was like, do I really need to say that? But yes, I really need to say this. Believe people. When people share their perspectives, believe them. Sometimes we can hear information, we're taking it in, and then when it comes time to translate it into a design, we edit out what we don't like, what we don't understand, what makes us feel uncomfortable. That's not what design is about. And if people have had the vulnerability and the bravery to even share with you things that are personally meaningful to them, and that doesn't end up in the final product, what message have you sent to them? You're saying that what you said wasn't important, You're also ruining the trust. Like, trust is so critical in our connection with our customers that we have to be conscious of how our design decisions can impact that. And if we open this conversation, we say, I'd like to know what's important to you, and then they don't see it in the final product, what message is that sending? We have to be conscious, and there is a level of responsibility that comes with having these conversations as well. And we have to honor our customers by incorporating what they're sharing. And habit number 6, share experience, either personal or professional experience. And this goes back to that dialogue, the dialogues that we have among ourselves as colleagues, as well as conversations that we can have even with our customers. So there is, once again, a level of trust that you create when you share from your own lived experience. There are some things that are universal. I do an activity sometimes with my DEI customers called the only exercise. And I have people take a few minutes to think about all the instances in their lives where they were the only, whether that was at work, it could have been something that they experienced in school as a child, something they experienced in whatever space that they're in. Everybody has had an only story. Everyone has felt that feeling. Not all of us have to live it day in and day out. And not all of us even see it when we're in a workplace and we have people who are basically underrepresented in their organization. We don't think about what their experience is like in a team meeting, in a client consultation, what that experience is day in and day out. So we have to be aware and we have to be willing to share that and to make space for those conversations, because we can all connect in so many different ways about issues related to identity and difference and what that's like. And if you really think about it, you can probably put yourself in a whole different place in engaging with your customers if you keep those kinds of experiences in mind. It makes space for a whole different conversation. So with those 6 habits in mind, I'd like to think that the conversations among those design teams that made those decisions that I shared at the beginning, it would have been a whole different conversation, right? That if there was that habit of asking questions, if there was that habit of engaging with customers and even engaging among your team, those design missteps could have been caught before they went out in the world. But it's important not just to wait for those moments. Like, this could have been when there was you were in the concept development phase. It could have been when you were really starting to get into what this final project was going to look like. But that's not the only time that we need to be acknowledging identity or having these kinds of conversations. Now, if you look at the design process, the way it exists right now, there is no real dedicated space-time step opportunity where we really authentically engage about the identity of our customers. Now, I adapted this particular model because this goes basically across all design disciplines. And that's what Design for Identity is about, too. It's not specifically just interiors. It's any way that we design. And but it's a missing piece in every space that I've been in. I've had exposure to graphic design in my marketing and communications work. I've had exposure to product design through my design thinking work. This shows up basically in every place, that we're not really talking about the things that are critical to identity. But what is interesting, though, is design thinking has becoming more of a buzzword, human-centered design. And it's encouraging to hear the emphasis on engaging with customers and observing their day-in experience in a place, in a space with a product, et cetera. But once again, we have to acknowledge, in product design, once again, there's a huge disconnect between the lived experience of the majority of the people who do it and the diversity of the customers that they're serving. And that gap is critical, because if you don't have the lived experience of the people that you're designing for, more than likely you're just going to make assumptions. You're going to design based on your understanding of who they are, because you don't have that connection, that shared lived experience. to be able to have a different kind of conversation and really get to the things that are culturally meaningful to them. So what we can do is we can evolve the design process. We don't completely have to scrap what we have, although I'm sure some people might be up for that. But what we can do is evolve it and intentionally create these opportunities throughout the design process to address identity. Now this diagram just shows a few of those places. Starting up front, actually, when what I call the empathize phase would probably be where we're having those initial client consultations. We're getting into that conversation to learn more about them, what are their preferences, what are their inspirations, and this is also a place where we can start having that conversation about identity. We can open that door because I do want to say, I mentioned before, you don't have to wait to start having these conversations until you have different people of different backgrounds on your team. You also don't have to wait until you personally understand everything about every identity. No one understands everything about every identity. And if you think you do even now, 30 seconds from now, you're going to be out of date because things are shifting. You look at, for example, the way we use pronouns, that's evolved. I know over my lifetime, and I'm a Gen Xer, the whole conversations about identity, from your racial, ethnic identity to, different terms that we can use even in common conversation, different sayings that we use, have all changed. So just know that you can't wait until you think you know everything to have the conversation. What you can do is ask questions, open-ended questions, that make space for someone to share with you from their own lived experience. And that's really powerful because it's not you giving them options based on the box that you're putting them in or your limited understanding. You're just creating a space to say what is important to you so that I can honor that and incorporate it. And starting from the very beginning of the design process to do that is very critical because that's where you're really getting all the information that's going to drive the rest of the process. And if you set that tone from the beginning, you're more likely to keep people engaged and maybe even be more likely to share even more throughout the process because they know you care. You've sent that signal that your input matters. I want to know this. I want to understand it so I can do better. And then it's critical too, as you go throughout the process, to go back and check in and validate. It's not just a matter of asking the question one time, taking the information, and they don't see what you did with it until the reveal. Because if that's the case and you got something wrong, it's too late to fix. So there's multiple instances created throughout the design process to go back to ask more questions and intentionally to make sure that once we get that information, also being willing to pivot if we got something if we didn't quite get it right. There's nothing wrong with not getting it right. There's something wrong with not ever asking the question and thinking that your assumption that you were basing all your design decisions on were the right ones. It's also important too to have conversations with your team throughout the process as well, not just your customers. Your team needs to do some kind of gut checks every once in a while too. Are we using the right resources? Are there people outside of our team that we should bring in or have conversations with so that we can appropriately address this identity and incorporate it into how we're designing? Are there other people who have been doing this on a more regular basis or more seasoned or more experienced in having these conversations? Can we talk to them and can we learn something from them and how they're doing this? Any lessons learned? So when you look at this, I'm just going to provide a couple examples of what these types of questions could look like. When you're beginning your initial consultation with your clients, you could ask questions like, what about your identity or cultural background would you like to be celebrated in this space? Once again, very open-ended and intentionally open-ended so that they can share with you to their comfort level. And I'll tell you, I'm always one who practices what they preach, and I don't ask people to do something I'm not willing to do. So I started asking this question of my own residential clients. And at first they kind of look like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Because we don't, once again, we don't usually explicitly talk about things like this. But it's amazing the conversations that happen once you open this door. Once again, this, it's really critical in building trust and really showing that you care and that you value people's identity. And it may take them a little while to really get to the good stuff. You might start with a couple of initial kind of surface level responses, but the more they think about it, because they likely have not been asked a lot themselves, they start thinking about it more, especially in your home. What would you like your home to say about you? Not just that you're trendy, not that you like rustic farmhouse. You want somebody to come into your home and say, oh, like, this is where Jessica lives. Like, I get this. People want to feel it. If they don't feel it anywhere else in the world, it should be their homes. And by that same token, you want to start having questions early on in the design process with your design team. And ask questions like, who among our team is best equipped and informed to engage authentically and effectively with these customers? Not everybody is going to be comfortable having these conversations. I know that off the bat. We can get better at it. We can practice. But there also may be the case that some people among your team may not have a similar kind of lived experience to the customers that you're working with, but maybe there are other resources that do. Have that conversation, understanding that shared lived experience is going to bring about a different conversation and is going to lead to different insights that are going to inform a design to make sure that it is a culturally competent one and one that respects identity. And I say that because relatability is very important, especially as designers. I use this analogy. If a complete stranger came up to you and asked you what it was like to grow up in your neighborhood, you would have a completely different conversation with them than you would with somebody else who was like, hey, I grew up down the street. Remember such and such? Remember how we used to have this block party for like the 4th of July? Or, they'd know who the neighbors were who lived down the street. You'd have a completely different conversation because you have some level of familiarity with that. You had some kind of experience that you can connect around. That goes to the importance of having more diversity in our profession. The more lived experiences we have among ourselves, the better we can connect with a broader audience. That's what this really boils down to. And then another question, as I mentioned, throughout the design process, it's not important just to ask one time at the beginning. It's important to go back. So if you've finished your design concept, you want to go back to your customers and ask, are we on the right path? Did we get it right? When you told us what was important to you about your identity and your background, did that translate into what we're seeing? And then if we didn't get it right, we have to be willing to take that input and pivot. And at the same time, with your design teams, you want to ask, what resources do we have access to that would help us in our research? Every client is going to have a different identity, so you're going to need different information. You can't just lean on what you always knew or the way you always did things, so there have to be really authentic conversations about other resources that you can access to get deeper information about other identities. So in the grand scheme of things, I'd like to think that cultural competence really is that missing piece in the design profession. It's that missing piece that if we address it and if we start incorporating it into what we do, we can connect with a broader, more diverse audience, understanding that is going to be necessary for our businesses, for our profession, because we have to keep up with the way that society is changing. And we also have to acknowledge the difference among society as it now stands. And I see this as an opportunity, especially for us as creative people. It gives us that many more ways that we can show up for our customers, that many more ways that we could design that we haven't even tapped into ourselves. So it's definitely about opportunity. And I would also like to, thank you, if you would indulge me, I just want to share a quick passage from my book before we move on get into a couple questions. When we heeded the call to become designers, we entered into multiple systems that historically placed one identity above others. These systems were consciously constructed to diminish people based on their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, class, religion, ability, and more. We stepped into an education system steeped in Western civilization that minimizes global diversity, while wondering why there's still so little diversity in the classrooms. Then we joined businesses and corporations that seek to profit from customer bases they don't even bother to understand or serve in meaningful ways. We operate in a political and economic environment that still has a long way to go to convince people whose identities have long been ignored to trust that attempts to uplift them are not simply pandering or fleeting publicity stunts that will abruptly end after the next election cycle. But just as we chose to enter these systems, we can choose to perpetuate them or disrupt them. We inherited them in their current form, but we must acknowledge that systems are upheld by individuals who enforce the rules and embody the behaviors necessary to keep them going. Cultural competence is what it's going to take to rewire our systems and empower ourselves and our fellow designers to broaden our view of humanity and celebrate the breadth and the depth of diversity among us. So I'd like to leave everybody with a challenge question. You don't have to answer this. You don't have to share it with your neighbor. You don't have to tell me. But I'd like to ask people to think about what's one thing you'll do differently based on what you learned today. Because all of this last hour or so that we've spent together, is about action. We can talk all day about difference, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if we are not changing the way we show up, none of that really matters. So think of one thing. It could be a little thing, it could be a huge thing, it could be a conversation you want to have to keep all this going, but definitely keep in mind. Start thinking about something different that you can do. And I invite you to follow me on LinkedIn or Instagram. Please connect with me. I love having this conversation. No matter where you are in your stages of engaging in conversation about identity, I'd love to connect. You can also contact me using the QR code here. And I think we might have a little time for some Q&A. All right, thank you. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? All questions are welcome. No? Mm-hmm. Yes. Got it. So the question was there a pain point that made me want to kind of pivot into talking about identity and this kind of intersection between DEI and design? There wasn't any one particular moment. It was more a matter of many moments, I would say. Having been in design spaces, especially in interior design, I will say, being in classrooms with very few people who look like me, in classrooms where no one at the front of the room looked like me, going to industry association meetings and feeling like no one even saw me, going into showrooms and being looked up and down like I didn't belong there. All of those things factored into, they were definitely part of my awareness. But I will say that once I got into DEI formally, because I've been doing, actually living kind of two different worlds in terms of my career, one in management consulting, where I pivoted to DEI in 2019, and the other in the interior design world. But when I started doing DEI work and having conversations day in and day out about difference and and seeing the challenges that people had even having the conversation, it really struck me, especially as designers, that we can't afford to be the ones not having the conversation. And when you look at there's a lot of talk about being performative organizations or people who say, oh, these things mean so much to me, but they're not acting in ways that honor people who have historically been excluded. It's like, we can't keep doing that, especially in design. Like, there shouldn't be those instances that I shared at the beginning. They shouldn't make it to world headlines. And it's, once again, not because people don't know that there's an issue, they're just not having the conversation until the damage is done. And I take issue personally with people talking a good game but not doing anything about it. So when those statements really started coming out and everyone posted the black square in the summer of 2020, like, oh, this is so important, like, we got to do something. And then it was crickets. That made me mad. But I also started making that connection too, though, that we were talking about why this was important, but we weren't telling people how to show up differently. And that's the space I wanted to fill. That's where I wanted to step in. I know this isn't the end-all, be-all. This isn't the final answer, but it is at least some steps that we can start taking to normalize that conversation. Thank you. Yes. I see Hadley. Hadley, I know.
Oh, I'm really loud. Thank you. Jessica, kind of following up what you just said, are there any other kind of thought leaders, authors in this space who you would recommend people in the audience look at, follow, look into?
Well, there are actually a few different groups of Black designers that are out there that people should know about. And they could be great resources for inspiration, for connecting with, once again, so you can learn about how maybe different identities can be expressed in what you're doing in design. One group I am personally proud to be a part of is Design Collective DC. We have a couple representatives here in the audience. It's a group of BIPOC designers in the Washington, DC area who are working to elevate the visibility of designers and anyone in the built environment from that BIPOC background. So that's one that's critical. There was books, is it Iconic Home, please? Yes, there's a book, someone here who is a featured designer is right here in our audience. It's a book celebrating Black designers that just came out. There are events about that actually during Market that you should check out. There's Badge, the Black Artists Guild, Artists and Designers Guild, thank you. That's another organization people should know about. And of course, I can speak to the organizations of Black designers because as a Black designer, I'm particularly aware of those. But there are many out there, for people of different backgrounds, and I think that we have to consciously and deliberately look for them because there's a lot of good information there. There are a lot of opportunities to connect and learn about different backgrounds through those groups. Thank you for that. Yes, we have another question.
More like a statement as an appreciation of you pointing something out, because there's also a fear, although I am minority, of people bringing up a question and asking whether this would be culturally offensive to you, because you also wondering whether you're crossing a line that maybe they feel like you're already thinking that they're different than you. You don't want to bring that up. So I appreciate from you saying that is okay to ask. That is okay to ask, and because personally I would hold back. Although I care, but you're just like on a fence, wondering whether that would be, even the question would be offensive. You see what I mean?
I appreciate you bringing that up. And when I ask people what they find most challenging about addressing identity, they always say, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Or they're afraid, just to your point, am I going to bring up something that these people, these people don't want to talk about? But that also goes to the reason why these questions are intentionally open-ended, the questions in that Design for Identity blueprint that I shared, because it allows people to share to the extent that they are comfortable. You may ask the question and people are like, no, I'm good. But that also goes to the importance of keeping that topic top of mind throughout the design process, because when you first ask, they may kind of be apprehensive. But as you get into like a more well-developed concept, more well-developed design, they may say, oh, well, since you asked, what about this? So I think it's, it is important though to initiate it, to acknowledge the elephant in the room, or just to open the door. And like I said, people will walk through that to the extent that they're comfortable, I think. Are there any other questions? Yes. Oh, here's Mike. Oh. Yes.
In design, particularly. Can you speak to that?
Yes, cultural appropriation. So there is cultural acknowledgement, and then there is cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation is essentially what happens when designers think they know what is relevant or what is representative of a particular identity, and they design based on that, or they design based on some kind of stereotypical notion of what's representative of an identity. And the difference between being a culturally competent designer and cultural appropriation is communication. Because cultural appropriation usually happens because people didn't ask a question. They may have a preconceived notion of what represents an identity, and they just go with that, as opposed to maybe going to the clients and saying, once again, hey, did we get this right? Is this something that resonates with you? Is this something that you feel honors your identity? And then acting based on that feedback. I think that would be that game changer that would keep cultural appropriation from happening. One more question?
So I do know that a lot of the younger generation is more identity focused, and we happen to be in companies where there might be older women who are from, older than us and don't maybe have the same values. So if none of this is being discussed in our company yet, what's the best way for my 20-year-old to go to my 50-year-old boss and be like, I would want this to be something that we do?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. And it's a question I think that is common in many spaces. What I usually encourage people to do is to kind of feel out who in their organization are allies, who are people who would be more open to the conversation, so that maybe as an individual, I know as a young professional, I was not going to be the one going in the boss's office to be like, we need to talk about this. But maybe you could find other people in the organization that you connect with more closely and ask them to kind of be the one to initiate the conversation. And also it could help to find other peers who have similar thoughts. And, not for the intent of, ganging up on leadership, but if you start having the conversation and realize that more often than not, it's not just you, you might have, be more confident in finding other ways to get that message kind of floated up in the organization. So is that helpful? Thank you. All right, any more questions? All right, well, thank you all. Thank you very much. I would like to invite you all too to join me for a book signing over at Hooker Furniture. If you'd like to come through there, that would be great. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to actually acknowledge another organization I'm a part of. I mentioned Design Collective DC, or DCDC. I'd encourage everyone to kind of check us out and see what we're doing. I am also involved with the Oasis Alliance, which is an organization that redesigns spaces for trauma survivors. We have a couple of representatives here from the Oasis Alliance. They're a great group. And I feel honored to be a part of both Design Collective DC and the Oasis Alliance, because they are living the principles of this book. They are taking design to people who have been historically excluded. They're involving them and elevating them in this design process, either as colleagues or as customers. And that's what we all need to do. So I feel like they both set a great example in that regard. And once again, would love to see you at the book signing, and thank you for being here.